Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and find yourself drawn into the mystery, consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an enormous difference to us. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is listening. Finally, if you enjoy content like this, subscribing really helps us continue bringing you these stories. Now, let's dive in. The fourth test was not the one that failed. They told us it was operator error, a flawed test. Human mistakes compounding in the dead of night until a reactor core tore itself apart and painted the sky with radiation. They gave us names to blame, procedures to question, a neat timeline that ended at exactly 23 minutes past 1 in the morning on April 26, 1986. But my cousin knew something else was happening that night, and he died because of it. Prologue. The letter that didn't make sense. The envelope arrived in June of 1986, 6 weeks after the explosion that the world had already stopped talking about. It was addressed to my aunt and uncle in Kiev, written in the cold, bureaucratic language that Soviet institutions used when they needed to deliver bad news without delivering truth. Sergei Volkov, deceased. Radiation exposure. Service to the state acknowledged. That was it. 3 lines. No location specified. No timeline given. No body to bury. My cousin had worked as a reactor instrumentation technician at Chernobyl Unit 4. He was 28 years old. He knew those systems better than anyone on his shift, and according to the official story, he had died responding to an accident caused by incompetence and design flaws. But 2 weeks before the explosion, Sergei had sent a letter home. I remember watching my aunt read it at the kitchen table, her face creasing with confusion. She passed it to my uncle, who read it twice before setting it down without comment. They didn't understand what Sergei meant, but I did, even then. Or at least, I understood that he was trying to tell them something without saying it directly. The letter mentioned the upcoming test everyone at the plant had been talking about, the turbine run-down experiment, a safety protocol drill that would simulate a power loss and measure how long the turbines could provide electricity while coasting to a stop. But then Sergei wrote something else. Tonight's test isn't for the turbine, that's just what they're saying. My aunt thought he was complaining about bureaucracy. My uncle assumed it was plant politics, but I was a journalist even then, just starting out working for a small paper in Kiev that mostly covered local corruption and housing scandals, and I knew what careful language looked like when someone couldn't speak freely. Sergei was telling them that something else was being tested that night, something they weren't supposed to talk about. After the official letter arrived, I went back and read Sergei's words again, and again. And I started asking questions that no one wanted to answer. Because if the turbine test wasn't the real test, then what actually caused Reactor 4 to explode? And if my cousin knew about it beforehand, why didn't anyone stop it? Chapter 1. The test that was never listed. The official explanation was neat, almost too neat. On April 25th, 1986, Chernobyl Unit 4 was scheduled to be shut down for routine maintenance. Engineers decided to use the shutdown as an opportunity to conduct a safety test on the turbine generator. The test would determine whether the turbines, while spinning down after a reactor trip, could generate enough electricity to power essential systems until emergency diesel generators kicked in. It was a reasonable test, a necessary test, and according to every official report, it was the test that went catastrophically wrong when operators disabled safety systems, reduced reactor power too far, and triggered a runaway chain reaction. But as I began digging into the details, I found references to something else. The first hint came from an engineer named Victor, who had worked at Chernobyl Unit 3. He'd been on duty the night of the explosion, just one building over from the catastrophe. I tracked him down to a small apartment in Minsk, where he was living on a medical pension, his health destroyed by radiation exposure during the cleanup. He didn't want to talk at first. Most people didn't. The fear lingered long after the Soviet Union stopped actively threatening people into silence. But eventually, over tea that he poured with shaking hands, Victor told me what he remembered. "Everyone knows about the turbine test," he said. "That's in all the reports. That's what they tell the IEA inspectors. But there were other things happening that night. Other programs running." "What kind of programs?" Victor looked at his hands. "We called it Program K. I don't know what the K stood for. We weren't supposed to know. It was marked in the logs but never explained. Just Program K, scheduled for the same window as the turbine test." "What was it testing?" "I don't know. That's the truth. But I know it involved the fuel, the reactor core configuration, and I know that military oversight was much higher than usual in the weeks before the shutdown." He leaned forward, his voice dropping even though we were alone. "The turbine test was real, but it was also cover. Something else was being tested that night, and when it failed, they needed a public story that didn't involve whatever Program K actually was. I found 3 other engineers who confirmed similar suspicions. None of them knew details, none of them had documentation, but all of them remembered the strange atmosphere in the weeks before the explosion, the unusual security, the classified meetings, the sense that something bigger than routine testing was happening. And all of them remembered that the logs referenced experiments that never appeared in any official report. The turbine test failed. That much was true, but I became convinced it failed because something else failed first, something they could never admit. Chapter 2. Why? Chernobyl was chosen. Chernobyl was not a random location. It sat in northern Ukraine, near the Belarusian border, surrounded by forests and small villages that had existed for centuries. It was isolated but accessible, massive but controllable, and it was entirely under state control, with no foreign oversight and minimal public scrutiny. It was, in other words, the perfect place to conduct experiments that couldn't be allowed to fail publicly. The plant had 4 operational reactors, with 2 more under construction. It generated enormous amounts of electricity for Ukraine and Belarus, but it also served other purposes that were never advertised to the people living in Pripyat or the surrounding towns. I found a set of procurement records from 1984 and 1985, buried in archives that had been partially declassified. They showed unusual materials being delivered to Chernobyl, specialised fuel rod configurations, monitoring equipment that exceeded standard operational needs, and most tellingly, equipment ordered by military departments rather than civilian energy ministries. Why would the military be ordering equipment for a civilian power plant? I spoke with a retired physicist named Anatoly, who had worked at a different Soviet nuclear facility. He'd never been to Chernobyl, but he understood the system. He understood how these plants operated within the broader structure of Soviet nuclear research. Chernobyl wasn't just generating power, he told me. All the RBMK reactors had dual purposes. Officially, they made electricity. Unofficially, they were laboratories. They could test fuel behaviours, neutron flux patterns, material degradation under extreme conditions, things you couldn't easily replicate in smaller research reactors. Why Reactor 4 specifically? Anatoly shrugged. Newer, better instrumentation, and far enough from the older units that if something went wrong, you could potentially contain it to one building, though obviously that didn't work out. He paused, considering his next words carefully. There were always rumours about military applications. Not weapons, exactly. The Soviets had plenty of weapons reactors, but experimental programs, testing things that might have defence implications, and Chernobyl's location, near military facilities, near restricted zones. It made sense. You could test something there and, if it succeeded, integrate it into military infrastructure. If it failed... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't. Need to. If it failed, you could blame operators, blame design flaws, blame anything except the real purpose of the test. Chapter 3. The military was there before the explosion official timelines placed the explosion at 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning on April 26th. The first responders, according to these same timelines, arrived shortly after. Firefighters from Pripyat, emergency crews from the plant, military units called in as the scale of the disaster became clear. But people who were there remember it differently. I found a former civil defence coordinator named Mikhail, who had been stationed near Chernobyl in 1986. He'd been involved in evacuation planning, though he hadn't been on duty the night of the explosion. But he knew people who had been, and he'd seen the transport logs. Military vehicles were on site before dawn, he told me. Not after the explosion. Before. Specialised units, chemical troops, radiation monitoring teams. They were mobilised hours before any official alarm went out. How is that possible? Mikhail gave me a long look. You tell me. Either they had advance warning that something was going to happen, or they were already there for another reason. I pressed him for documentation, but he said most of the logs from that night had been destroyed or reclassified. What he remembered, though, was the timing. Units moving into position in the early hours of April 26th. Roadblocks established before civilians knew anything was wrong. Restricted zones set up around the plant before the word evacuation was ever spoken. Another witness, a truck driver named Oleg who'd been making deliveries to the plant that week, described seeing armed personnel near Reactor 4 in the days before the explosion. Not normal security, military police. Officers who checked credentials multiple times and restricted movement in ways that seemed excessive for a routine shutdown. I met Oleg at a truck stop outside Kyiv, a grey place that smelled of diesel fuel and old coffee. He was hesitant to talk, kept looking over his shoulder even though the Soviet Union had been gone for years. Some fears don't fade with political systems. It felt like something was being protected, Oleg said, his voice low. Or hidden. I couldn't tell which. But I've made deliveries to military facilities. I know what that kind of security looks like, and in the 3 days before the explosion, Chernobyl had that same feeling. Like the plant wasn't just a power station anymore, like it had become something else. He described checkpoints that hadn't existed the previous week, credentials being verified against lists that guards carried in sealed envelopes, entire sections of the facility blocked off with new barriers and warning signs. On April 24th, I delivered equipment to the main administrative building. While I was waiting for signatures, I saw officers going in and out of a conference room. High-ranking, the kind who don't normally show up for turbine tests, and they looked worried. Not the kind of worried you get before a routine procedure. The kind of worried you get when something's already gone wrong and you're trying to figure out how to fix it. Oleg pulled out a delivery manifest from 1986. Faded and creased from years of being carried in his wallet. He'd kept it all this time, he said, because it was the only proof he had that he'd been there. The manifest showed deliveries on April 23rd, 24th and 25th. Standard industrial equipment for the first 2 days. But the April 25th delivery was marked differently. Special handling, military receiving, a notation in the corner that read K-Program Materials. I asked what K-Program meant, Oleg said. The receiving officer told me to forget I'd seen it. Not in a threatening way, in a tired way, like he was exhausted from carrying secrets. The pieces suggested a disturbing possibility. If military units were on site before the explosion, they either knew something catastrophic was about to happen, or they were there as part of whatever Program K actually involved. Either way, the official narrative of a sudden, unexpected accident didn't match the reality. And the presence of military personnel days before the disaster suggested planning, preparation, the kind of infrastructure you build around an experiment, not an accident. Chapter 4. The reactor did not explode once. The official story describes a single catastrophic event. At 1:23 and 40 seconds on the morning of April 26th, a massive power surge caused Reactor 4's core to rupture. The explosion destroyed the reactor building, ejected radioactive material into the atmosphere, and started fires that burned for days. One explosion, one moment of failure. But seismic data tells a different story. I obtained access to seismographic records from monitoring stations in Ukraine and Belarus. These stations continuously recorded ground vibrations, used primarily for detecting earthquakes, but sensitive enough to pick up large industrial events. The data showed 2 distinct energy releases that morning. The first occurred around midnight. It registered as a moderate disturbance, consistent with an internal structural failure. Not large enough to destroy a building, but significant enough to indicate something had gone seriously wrong inside the reactor. The second occurred at 1:23. exactly when the official timeline placed the explosion. This was the massive event that everyone knew about, the one that destroyed the building and scattered radioactive debris across the surrounding area. But if there were two events, what happened during the hours between them? I found a former plant security officer named Leonid, who had been on duty that night. He'd been stationed at the perimeter, far enough from Reactor 4 to survive, but close enough to see what happened. There was a sound around midnight, he remembered, deep, like something heavy breaking inside a building. And then there was confusion, people running, radio chatter, but no alarm, no evacuation order, just chaos that was being contained. What do you think happened? Leonid shook his head. I think something failed inside the reactor, something that exposed the core. And I think they spent the next hour trying to figure out what to do about it before everything went completely to hell. The implication was staggering. If the reactor core had been compromised hours before the main explosion, then dozens of workers had been exposed to lethal radiation levels while trying to manage a situation that was already beyond saving. And if that was true, then the official timeline wasn't just incomplete. It was a deliberate reconstruction designed to hide what actually happened. Chapter 5. The men sent in first. In the official narrative, the first responders were firefighters and emergency crews who arrived after the explosion. Brave men who fought the fires and contained the immediate crisis, many of whom died from acute radiation syndrome in the days and weeks that followed. But there were others. Men who were sent into high radiation zones before the main explosion. Men whose names don't appear in the official lists of first responders. I learned about them from a nurse named Irina, who had worked at the medical facility in Pripyat. In the hours and days after the disaster, she treated hundreds of people for radiation exposure. She kept notes, unofficial records of who came through and what their symptoms were. There were workers who came in before the firefighters, she told me. Maintenance staff, technicians. Their exposure levels were enormous, far higher than what they should have been if they'd only been exposed after the main explosion. How is that possible? It's not, Irina said flatly, unless they were already inside contaminated areas before the explosion happened. She showed me her notes, faded and water-stained but still legible. Names, times, symptoms, estimated exposure levels. Several workers had been brought in around 2 a.m, just after the main explosion, but their radiation doses suggested they'd been exposed for hours. One entry stood out. Pyotr Markov, instrumentation technician, brought in at 0 to 15 hours, exposure estimated at 600 Röntgen minimum, complained of nausea, confusion, severe headache, kept saying we were just supposed to observe. 600 Röntgen was a lethal dose, and Pyotr's symptoms suggested he'd been exposed long before 2 a.m. We were just supposed to observe. What had he been sent to observe? I tried to find Pyotr Markov, but he died 3 days after the explosion. Acute radiation syndrome. His death was recorded, but his work assignments that night were not. Irina had more to tell me, though. After our first meeting, she called me back 3 days later. She'd been thinking about Pyotr, she said, remembering more details. He wasn't alone when they brought him in, she told me. There were 4 others, all instrumentation technicians, all with exposure levels that didn't match the timeline, and they all kept asking the same questions. Where's the containment team? Why didn't the alarms work earlier? How long had the core been exposed? She paused, her voice shaking slightly. One of them, I can't remember his name, he grabbed my arm while I was trying to get an IV started. He was already delirious, his skin was red and blistering, but he looked at me and said, "They sent us down at midnight. We measured the radiation levels. We reported them, and they sent us back down anyway." "Did you report this?" Irina laughed bitterly. "To who? The same people who'd sent them down there in the first place? The same officials who were already constructing the narrative about operator error? I was a nurse. I treated patients. I documented what I saw. But I knew better than to ask questions that no one wanted answered." The pattern repeated. Multiple workers with exposure levels that didn't match the official timeline. Multiple workers who'd apparently been in high radiation areas before they should have been. But what haunted me most was what Irina said next. They knew they were dying. All of them. You could see it in their eyes. And what made it worse was that they knew they'd been sent in there deliberately. They'd been ordered to witness something, to gather data about something, and it had killed them. And they understood, even in their delirium, that no one would ever acknowledge what they'd been sent to do. They'd been sent into the reactor building for a reason, not to fix anything, to witness something, and whatever they saw killed them. Chapter 6. The blue light was not normal. In the testimonies from survivors, the detail appears repeatedly. A strange blue-white light that workers described seeing near the reactor core in the hours before and after the explosion. Officially, this is explained as Cherenkov radiation. When charged particles move through a medium faster than light travels in that medium, they emit a characteristic blue glow. It's a well-understood phenomenon, common in nuclear reactors. But the descriptions from Chernobyl didn't quite match typical Cherenkov radiation. Workers described the light as pulsing, intensifying and fading in waves. Some reported feeling electromagnetic interference, watches stopping, radio equipment malfunctioning. One worker, a crane operator named Dmitry, described seeing the light through a window in the reactor hall moments before the main explosion. I found Dmitry living in a small apartment in Belarus, still on medical monitoring decades after the disaster. His hands shook constantly. Neurological damage, the medical report said, though whether from radiation or trauma was impossible to determine. It wasn't steady, he told me, his voice still haunted decades later. It was like something breathing, getting brighter, then dimmer, then brighter again. And there was a sound, high-pitched, made your teeth hurt. He got up and walked to the window, staring out at nothing. I was operating the crane in Reactor 3 that night. We had a clear view across to Reactor 4 through the windows in the upper levels. Around midnight, maybe a little after, I saw the light start. At first I thought it was just normal operation. Blue glow, that's not unusual. But then it started pulsing, like a heartbeat, and the intensity kept increasing. Dimitri's hands clenched on the windowsill. My watch stopped. Just stopped. The crane control started acting strange, responding slowly, not quite right. And then I heard people shouting over the radio, panicked voices, someone yelling about neutron flux, someone else demanding to know why the control rods weren't responding properly. What did you do? I watched. That's all I could do. The light kept getting brighter. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like watching something that shouldn't exist. And then, maybe an hour later, the whole building exploded. But the light, that pulsing light, that had been happening long before the explosion. These descriptions suggested something beyond normal reactor behaviour. I consulted with a nuclear physicist named Elena, who specialised in reactor dynamics. I described what witnesses had reported, without mentioning Chernobyl specifically. Just the symptoms, the pulsing light, the electromagnetic effects. That sounds like uncontrolled neutron bursts, she said immediately. Fluctuating criticality. The reactor is going in and out of critical states rapidly. It's extremely dangerous and shouldn't happen in a properly designed system. What would cause it? Elena thought for a moment. Fuel configuration problems. If the fuel assembly is damaged or arranged in ways it's not supposed to be, or if you're running experiments with unusual fuel types or geometries, anything that disrupts the normal neutron flux patterns. Would military applications involve unusual fuel configurations? Eleanor's expression closed down. I wouldn't know about that. But her reaction told me everything I needed to know. The blue light wasn't just Cherenkov radiation. It was evidence of a reactor core behaving in ways it was never supposed to behave. Ways that suggested someone had deliberately altered its configuration to test something new. Something that pulsed like a heartbeat before it died. Chapter 7. Why the truth could never be admitted. By this point in my investigation, I'd accumulated enough evidence to write a story. Not proof, exactly, but a compelling argument that something else had been tested at Chernobyl that night. Something beyond a turbine safety drill. But I also understood why that story could never be officially acknowledged. Admitting that experimental testing caused the disaster would mean admitting violations of international treaties. The Soviet Union had signed agreements limiting certain types of nuclear research. Admitting military involvement would raise questions about weapon development, treaty compliance, and oversight failures at the highest levels of government. It would mean admitting that party officials had prioritised experimental programs over the safety of their own citizens. It would mean acknowledging that the entire Soviet nuclear infrastructure was built on secrecy so deep that even catastrophic failures could be rewritten. The truth would collapse trust not just in Chernobyl, but in every nuclear facility in the Soviet Union. It would invite international investigations that the state couldn't control. It would expose vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. So instead, they chose a simpler narrative. Operator error, flawed reactor design, human mistakes compounding in the night. Blame the technicians who disabled safety systems. Blame the engineers who designed the RBMK reactor. Blame anyone and everyone except the program that turned a power plant into a laboratory. It was a calculated trade. A few scapegoats in exchange for protecting the broader system. And it worked. The world accepted the official story. Chernobyl became a cautionary tale about the dangers of human error and inadequate safety culture. The liquidators cleaned up the mess. The sarcophagus sealed the reactor. Life went on. But the real story stayed buried. Buried with men like my cousin, who died because someone needed eyes inside the core. Chapter 8. The Missing Records. If Program K existed, there should have been records, documentation, reports. The Soviet system was nothing if not bureaucratic. Every test, every experiment, every protocol required paperwork. But when I tried to find records from April 25th and 26th, 1986, I found holes. Not everything was missing. The turbine test documentation existed. Shift logs from other reactors survived. Maintenance schedules, security reports, even cafeteria inventories from that week were archived. But specific records from Reactor 4 during the critical hours were gone. Reactor monitoring data from midnight to 2 in the morning. Missing. Personnel movement logs showing who was where during the test. Missing. Internal communications between the control room and plant management. Missing. I spoke with an archivist named Svetlana who had worked in the records department at Chernobyl before the explosion. She'd been evacuated with everyone else, but she'd helped compile documentation in the months afterward. We met in a cafe in Kiev, the kind of anonymous place where conversations disappeared into background noise. Svetlana was in her 60s now, worn down by decades of carrying knowledge she couldn't share. Some things were lost in the evacuation, she acknowledged, but not everything. Some files were removed deliberately, before the investigation started, before anyone from Moscow arrived to take control of the scene. Who removed them? Svetlana hesitated, stirring her tea with hands that had developed a slight tremor. People in uniforms, not plant security, military. They came through in the first few days and took boxes of documents. We were told it was for the investigation, but those files never appeared in any official report. She leaned forward, her voice dropping. I kept an inventory, part of my job. I knew what was in those boxes because I'd filed most of it myself. Reactor monitoring logs, internal communications between control room staff and plant management, personnel assignment sheets showing who was working where and when, technical specifications for fuel assemblies, all dated April 25th and 26th. Do you still have the inventory? I destroyed it in 1992. I was warned that keeping it would be dangerous. Not in a dramatic way. Just a quiet suggestion from someone who knew what happened to people who asked too many questions. Svetlana looked out the window at the street, watching people pass by in their ordinary lives. But I remember the specific files that disappeared. And I remember that most of them had K-program designations in the classification codes. I didn't know what it meant at the time, but later, when I heard rumours about experimental testing, I understood. I tried to access military archives, but those requests were denied. Classified, they said. National security, they said. The denials came in official letters with impressive letterhead and bureaucratic language that said everything and nothing. After the third denial, I received a phone call. No introduction, just a voice explaining that continuing to request these specific files would be counterproductive to my career and potentially my personal safety. It wasn't a direct threat. Nothing I could report to authorities. Just a clear message that some doors were meant to stay closed. Even decades later, with the Soviet Union gone and archives supposedly opening, certain files remained sealed. I submitted Freedom of Information requests through the new Russian system. I contacted Ukrainian officials. I reached out to international organisations that had investigated Chernobyl. Some requests were ignored, some were denied with vague justifications. A few were acknowledged but never fulfilled, trapped in bureaucratic limbo that felt deliberately designed to outlast anyone's patience. The absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. Someone had decided what the world should know about Chernobyl, and they'd made sure everything else disappeared. The question that haunted me wasn't just what was in those missing files. It was who had the authority to make them disappear across two different political systems, across decades, across the collapse of an entire empire. Whatever Program K was, it was important enough to protect long after the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Chapter 9. The Last Proof. I'd been investigating for 3 years when I got the call. A retired physicist named Grigory wanted to meet. He'd heard about my research through mutual contacts and had something to show me. He wouldn't say what it was over the phone, just that I should come to his dacha outside Moscow if I wanted to understand what really happened. I went. Grigory was in his 70s, thin and tired, living alone in a small house surrounded by birch trees. The dacha was modest, the kind of place Soviet professionals retired to when their usefulness to the state had expired. Inside, it smelled of old books and wood smoke. He made tea and we talked about irrelevant things for an hour, both of us knowing that he was deciding whether to trust me. We discussed the weather, the state of Russian politics, the price of bread. Normal conversation that felt like a test. Finally, he set down his teacup and looked at me directly. "You've been asking questions about Program K for 3 years," he said. It wasn't a question. "You've spoken to engineers, archivists, witnesses. You've had requests denied. You've been warned to stop, but you're still asking." I didn't confirm or deny. I waited. Grigory stood and went to a locked drawer in an old desk. He pulled out a key from a chain around his neck, unlocked it, and retrieved a single sheet of paper sealed in a plastic sleeve. "This is a copy," he said. "The original is somewhere I'll never tell you, but I've kept this for 30 years, waiting for someone who might actually care about the truth." He handed it to me with hands that shook slightly. It was a memo, dated April 27th, 1986, marked classified. Addressed to a department I didn't recognise, some combination of letters and numbers that suggested military scientific coordination. The text was brief. Reactor behaviour exceeded modelled parameters under K conditions. Secondary containment failure occurred at 0012 hours, primary failure at 0123. Event must be attributed to operational failure. All K program references to be removed from official documentation. Military oversight logs to be sealed under national security classification. I read it 3 times, my hand starting to shake just like Grigory's. 0012 hours, midnight and 12 minutes, exactly when witnesses reported the first disturbance, the seismic data's first event, the moment when something inside Reactor 4 began to fail. And there it was, in official documentation, acknowledging that the event had to be attributed to operational failure. Not that it was operational failure, that it must be attributed to it. "What are K conditions?" I asked. Grigory sat back down heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. "I don't know the details. I was a physicist at a different facility, and we had our own classified programs, but I know it involved experimental fuel configurations, testing reactor behaviour under scenarios that weren't part of normal operations. The goal was to understand core dynamics under extreme conditions, push the boundaries of what we thought was possible. For what purpose? Officially? Safety research? Understanding reactor limits so we could design better systems, operate them more efficiently, extract more power. But the military was involved, which meant it was never just about civilian applications." Grigory stood and walked to the window, looking out at the birch trees. "You have to understand the context. This was 1986. The Cold War wasn't over. The Americans had programs we didn't fully understand. We had programs they didn't know about. Nuclear technology was power, both literally and politically. Every major power was pushing boundaries, testing limits, trying to gain advantages that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. So what was really being tested that night? I don't know, and I'm not sure anyone still alive does. But I know that whatever it was, it failed spectacularly. And I know that the decision to cover it up came from the highest levels. This memo wasn't written by plant management. The language, the authority to order document destruction, the classification level, this came from Moscow, from people who understood that admitting the truth would be more damaging than the disaster itself. Why are you giving this to me? Grigory looked at me with tired eyes that had seen too much. Because people died for something they didn't understand. Because the world deserves to know that Chernobyl wasn't just an accident. Because I'm old enough now that I don't care what happens to me. And because someone needs to remember that the official story is a construction, not the truth. He paused. But I'm also giving this to you with no illusions. You won't be able to publish it. Not in any meaningful way. The systems that protected this secret 30 years ago are still in place. They've changed names, changed organisational structures, but the imperative to keep certain knowledge buried that survives political transitions. I left with a copy of the memo tucked in my jacket, my mind racing. It wasn't enough to prove everything, but it was enough to prove that something had been hidden. Something they'd decided to call operational failure. Something that exceeded modelled parameters and required a coordinated cover-up spanning military and civilian institutions. As I drove back to Moscow, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to be followed. The paranoia felt justified. I'd just been given documentation that proved a government conspiracy to falsify the cause of one of history's worst nuclear disasters. The question wasn't whether the secret was real. The question was whether I would live long enough to figure out what to do with it. Chapter 10. What really melted. Looking back through all the evidence, all the testimonies, all the holes in the official story, I came to understand what happened at Chernobyl. Reactor 4 didn't just fail, it revealed a flaw in Soviet nuclear experimentation. Someone, somewhere in the military scientific complex, decided to use a routine shutdown as an opportunity to test something. Maybe it was fuel behaviour under unusual conditions. Maybe it was reactor control systems under stress. Maybe it was something I still don't fully understand. They called it Program K. They scheduled it for the same night as the turbine test, using the public experiment as cover for the secret one. And sometime around midnight on April 26th, something went wrong. The reactor core behaved in ways they didn't predict. Neutron flux became unstable. The fuel configuration created feedback loops that the control systems couldn't manage. The reactor started destroying itself from the inside. They tried to control it. They sent workers in to observe and report. They scrambled to find a solution before the situation became impossible to contain. But nuclear physics doesn't care about political necessity. The core continued its death spiral, and at 1:23 in the morning, the containment failed completely. The building exploded. The radioactive plume spread across Europe, and in the aftermath, someone made a decision. The truth about Program K would never be admitted. The experimental nature of the test would be classified. The military involvement would be denied. The missing hours between midnight and the explosion would be erased from official records. Instead, they would blame operators. They would blame design flaws. They would create a narrative of human error and inadequate safety culture. It was cleaner that way, simpler, less dangerous to the state. My cousin Sergei didn't die responding to an accident. He died because someone needed eyes inside the core when Program K started failing. He was sent in to witness an experiment escaping containment, and he died knowing that whatever he was seeing would never be acknowledged. Epilogue. The concrete lid. They sealed Reactor 4 under a massive concrete sarcophagus. Thousands of workers, many of whom would later die from radiation exposure, entombed the destroyed reactor in cement and steel. The official story sealed responsibility just as effectively. I tried to publish what I'd learned. I wrote a comprehensive article laying out all the evidence, all the inconsistencies, all the questions that official reports couldn't answer. My newspaper refused to run it. Too controversial, they said. Too speculative. Too dangerous. The editor, a man I'd worked with for 8 years, took me aside and spoke quietly. "I believe you," he said. "I believe something was covered up, but this paper can't survive publishing this story. We'll lose access to government sources, advertising will dry up, and honestly, I'm worried about what might happen to you if we run it." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being practical, and he was probably right. I tried other outlets. Same response. Some editors were sympathetic but cautious. Others were hostile, accusing me of disrespecting the memory of those who died, of spreading conspiracy theories, of undermining public trust in nuclear safety when the world needed nuclear power. One editor, a woman who'd covered Chernobyl extensively in the immediate aftermath, told me something that stuck with me. "Even if you're right," she said, "what do you think will happen? The Soviet Union is gone. The people who made these decisions are dead or beyond accountability. The reactor is sealed. Publishing this won't change anything except make you unemployable and possibly unsafe. Is the truth worth your career, your safety, your life?" I didn't have a good answer. None of them would publish the story. The paper I worked for was eventually shut down, though officially for unrelated financial reasons. Declining readership, they said. Market forces. The usual justifications for making inconvenient journalism disappear. I moved to a smaller publication, then a smaller one still. Each transition meant less resources, less reach, less ability to investigate anything meaningfully. Eventually I stopped being a journalist in any meaningful sense, and started being someone who wrote press releases and covered city council meetings. The investigation haunted me. I'd spent 3 years chasing truth, accumulating evidence, talking to witnesses who trusted me with their stories. And in the end, I couldn't do anything with it. I kept all my notes, all my interviews, all the documentation I'd gathered, locked in a safe in my apartment waiting for... what? I didn't know. Some future moment when the truth might matter, when someone might listen. Years passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Archives opened. Researchers gained access to previously classified materials, but the key files about Program K never appeared. I watched as historians wrote books about Chernobyl. Some were excellent, meticulously researched, deeply compassionate about the human cost. But they all worked within the framework of the official narrative. Operator error, design flaws, safety culture failures. All true in their way, but not the whole truth. Occasionally, someone would stumble across a detail that hinted at something deeper. A reference to unexplained military presence, a gap in the timeline, missing documentation. But without the broader context, without the accumulated evidence I'd gathered, these details remained isolated curiosities rather than pieces of a larger pattern. Whatever documentation existed about Program K remains locked away, classified under national security protocols that survived the transition from Soviet to Russian control. The institutional imperative to protect certain secrets transcends political systems. I still have Grigory's memo, hidden where no one will find it unless I choose to reveal it. I still have my notes, my interviews, my timeline of evidence. But I've accepted that the truth about Chernobyl will likely die with my generation. The men who knew what really happened are gone. Grigory died 6 years after giving me that memo. Victor, the engineer from Unit 3, died from cancer related to his radiation exposure. Irina, the nurse, passed away without ever seeing her testimony acknowledged. One by one, the witnesses are disappearing. The documents that would prove the conspiracy are destroyed or sealed beyond reach. The institutional memory has been rewritten so many times that even participants in the event probably believe the official version now. Repetition creates reality, and the official story has been repeated for nearly 40 years. My cousin Sergei is buried in a cemetery outside Kiev, his grave marked with a simple stone that doesn't mention how he died or why. Sometimes I visit and try to explain why I couldn't tell his story properly, why the truth he died knowing remains classified. I imagine he would understand. He worked in a system where some knowledge was too dangerous to speak aloud, where certain experiments couldn't be acknowledged, where individual lives mattered less than protecting institutional secrets. Chernobyl became a symbol, a warning about the dangers of nuclear power, about human fallibility, about the costs of inadequate safety culture, all of which is true in its way. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that Chernobyl wasn't just the cost of human error. It was the cost of learning something they were never supposed to learn. It was the moment an experiment escaped containment, and someone decided that the world could never know what was really being tested. My cousin Sergei knew, and it got him killed. 30-some years later, I finally understand what he was trying to tell us in that last letter home. Tonight's test isn't for the turbine. That's just what they're saying. He was right, and no one will ever officially admit it. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I should have tried harder. Published the story anyway, consequences be damned. Gone to international press, to foreign journalists who might have been beyond the reach of Russian institutional pressure. But I also know how these stories end for people who push too hard against secrets that powerful institutions want kept. Some truths are too dangerous to tell, some lies are too useful to abandon, and some disasters are too complex to explain honestly, without admitting things that no government wants to admit. The concrete sarcophagus sealed Reactor 4, the official story sealed responsibility, and the real truth remains buried under layers of classification, destroyed documentation, and calculated silence. Maybe someday, long after everyone involved is dead, the full story will emerge. Maybe some future historian will find the missing pieces and reconstruct what actually happened that night. Or maybe Program K will remain classified forever, another secret carried to the grave by men who knew that some knowledge is too dangerous to survive them. All I know is this. My cousin didn't die in an accident. He died because someone needed eyes inside the core. And the reactor didn't just fail. It revealed something they were never supposed to learn. End. Echoes of Machiavelli, the journalist who found Tupac. The email arrived at 3 a.m. Ava Ramirez had been awake anyway, scrolling through decades-old forum posts about unsolved mysteries in hip-hop history, when her phone lit up with a notification that made her heart skip. The glow from the screen cast blue shadows across her cramped studio apartment in Los Angeles, illuminating the wall where she had pinned articles about cold cases and industry cover-ups. Empty coffee cups littered her desk. The city outside her window was silent except for the occasional wail of a siren cutting through the darkness. The subject line was blank. This sender was a scrambled string of characters that looked like it had been generated by a random algorithm. But the message itself was crystal clear. Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. She read it 3 times, her pulse quickening with each pass. September 7th. Everyone who knew anything about hip-hop knew that date. September 7th, 1996. The night Tupac Shakur was shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. The night that changed music forever. The night that spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories and launched an entire subculture of people who believed the most famous rapper in the world had faked his own death. Ava had covered music industry scandals for 7 years, clawing her way up from unpaid blog post to a staff position at one of the most respected music journalism sites on the internet. She had exposed label corruption, uncovered ghostwriting schemes, and revealed the truth behind manufactured beefs designed to sell records. Her apartment walls were covered with printed articles bearing her byline, each one a small victory in a war against an industry that thrived on secrecy and spin. But this was different. This was the white whale. This was the story that could define a career or destroy it completely. She'd grown up listening to Tupac. Her older brother Marcus had been obsessed with him, playing All Eyes on Me until the CD was scratched beyond repair. When Marcus was killed in a drive-by shooting when Ava was 16, she had clung to Tupac's music like a lifeline, finding solace in the raw anger and vulnerability of someone who understood what it meant to live surrounded by violence. Investigating Tupac's death wasn't just professional ambition, it was personal in ways she had never admitted to anyone. She looked at the message again. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. What the hell did that mean? The first 2 phrases seemed obvious enough. 2 fates could refer to Tupac's alleged death versus his survival. 1 body could mean the body that was supposedly Tupac in the casket. But 1 jar? That made no sense. Was it metaphorical? Literal? Some kind of code? She screenshot the email and saved it to 3 different cloud services, then forwarded it to her encrypted backup account. If this was real, if someone actually had information about what happened to Tupac, she couldn't risk losing the only contact point. By sunrise, she had booked a flight to Las Vegas. By noon, she had created a secure cloud folder and begun compiling everything she could find about that night in September 1996. And by midnight, she was convinced that someone out there knew something the rest of the world didn't. This wasn't a hoax. This was an invitation. The question was, an invitation to the truth, or an invitation to become another casualty in a cover-up that had lasted nearly 3 decades? Act 1. The Unsettled Record. The official story was simple enough. On September the 7th, 1996, Tupac Shakur attended a Mike Tyson boxing match at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. After the fight, he and Death Row Records CEO Marion Knight got into an altercation with a gang member in the casino lobby. Security footage showed the confrontation. Witnesses confirmed it happened. What came next was inevitable in the logic of gang violence and street justice. Later that night, Tupac and Knight were driving to a nightclub when a white Cadillac pulled up alongside their black BMW at a red light on Flamingo Road. Someone in the Cadillac opened fire. 4 bullets hit Tupac. 2 hit his chest, 1 his arm, 1 his thigh. Knight was grazed by shrapnel but otherwise unharmed. The Cadillac sped away into the night and was never found. Tupac was rushed to University Medical Center. He underwent multiple surgeries. His right lung was removed. For 6 days, he fought for his life in the intensive care unit while the world held its breath. Then, on September the 13th, 1996, at 4:03 in the afternoon, Tupac Amaru Shakur was pronounced dead. He was 25 years old. The killer was never caught. The case went cold. The official investigation stalled, and the conspiracy theories began almost immediately. Ava sat in her hotel room in Las Vegas, surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, glowing with forum threads and archived news articles. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the desert heat that pressed against the windows. She had been researching for 3 days straight, barely sleeping, living on coffee and takeout from the casino buffets downstairs. The carpet smelled like cigarette smoke that had seeped in from the hallway. The walls were thin enough that she could hear muffled conversations and slot machine jingles from the casino floor below. The more she dug, the more questions emerged, spreading out like cracks in a windshield after impact. Why was there no public autopsy photo? Why was the casket closed at the funeral? Why did Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, cremate his body immediately after a private ceremony that excluded most of the media? Why were so many details about his final days kept under seal by hospital privacy laws that seemed unusually strict even by medical standards? She had created a timeline on the wall using tape and printed documents, connecting events with red string like something out of a detective thriller. It looked obsessive because it was obsessive, but obsession was what separated good journalists from mediocre ones. You had to be willing to lose yourself in the story, to let it consume you until the truth revealed itself. She found a Reddit post from June 5th, 2024, that had caught her attention during her initial research. The user claimed to have been tracking the online conspiracy community for years and had noticed something strange. The Tupac is Alive sites went deep in the archive. Malaysia, Cuba, a Navajo reservation. I saw movement. Movement? What kind of movement? She had tried to contact the user directly but received no response. The account had gone dormant shortly after that post, which was either suspicious or simply the natural life cycle of someone who had moved on to other interests. She started following the breadcrumbs. There were websites dedicated to photographic analysis, comparing tattoos on a man photographed in Belize to Tupac's documented body art. The comparisons were surprisingly detailed, noting the placement of his thug life tattoo across his stomach, the theatrical masks on his shoulder, the cross with his mother's name Afeni on his back. There were audio experts claiming voice pattern matches on recordings allegedly made years after his death, citing pitch analysis and speech patterns that they insisted were identical. There were sightings reported from a dozen countries, each one detailed enough to sound plausible but vague enough to remain unverified. The persistence was what struck her. Nearly 3 decades after his death, people were still looking, still analysing, still believing. This wasn't just nostalgia or denial. This was something deeper, a cultural wound that refused to heal because it had never been properly examined in the first place. She decided to reach out to people who had actually known him, people whose credibility couldn't be easily dismissed. First, she contacted a former member of the Outlaws, Tupac's affiliated rap group. The man, who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity, told her something that stuck in her mind. They spoke on an encrypted video call at 2 a.m, the man's face partially shadowed to protect his identity. Behind him, Ava could see gold and platinum records hanging on the wall, relics from a different era. Pac was paranoid near the end, he said, his voice carrying the weight of old memories and older regrets. Not crazy paranoid, smart paranoid. He knew people wanted him dead. He talked about disappearing sometimes, just vanishing and starting over. We thought he was joking, you know. Pac was always talking big, always had some master plan he was working on. But looking back, maybe he was planning something. He asked me once what I would do if I had to start my life over with a new identity. I laughed it off. Now I wonder if he was testing the idea, seeing how people would react. Did he ever mention specific places he might go? Ava asked, leaning closer to her screen. The man shook his head. Not really, but he talked a lot about Africa, about going back to his roots. He mentioned Cuba a few times because of his stepfather's connections there, and he was fascinated by islands, isolated places where you could see people coming from miles away. He said cities made you vulnerable, too many angles of attack. Do you think he's alive? There was a long pause. The man looked away from the camera, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wasn't sure he should say. I think Pac understood something most people don't, he finally said. Death is easy. It's living that's hard. If he wanted to disappear, if he wanted to become someone else, he had the resources and the intelligence to pull it off. Do I think he did it? I don't know, but I wouldn't bet against him. Pac always won in the end, even when it looked like he was losing. Next, she interviewed a music historian who specialised in 1990s hip-hop culture. The historian, a professor at UCLA named James Robertson, met her at a coffee shop near campus. He was in his 50s, dressed in a worn leather jacket and a vintage Public Enemy shirt, a man who had lived through the era he now taught about. His office, he had told her, was buried in boxes of vinyl records and archived interviews from the golden age of hip-hop. The Don Killuminati, the 7-day theory, Robertson explained, stirring sugar into his coffee with methodical precision. was released under the alias Machiavelli. That's a reference to Niccolò Machiavelli, the Italian philosopher who wrote about political strategy and deception. One of Machiavelli's ideas was that faking one's death could be a useful tactic for escaping enemies and starting fresh. Tupac read extensively in prison. He knew this. He studied everything from Shakespeare to Sun Tzu, and he chose that exact alias for his posthumous album, which, by the way, was recorded in only 7 days. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. "So you think the album title was intentional?" Ava asked. "That he was leaving a message?" Robertson smiled. Tupac didn't do anything by accident. Every tattoo, every album cover, every lyric was carefully constructed to convey meaning. The man was a poet and a revolutionary, but he was also incredibly strategic. If you listen to the Machiavelli album, really listen to it, there are lines that feel like someone saying goodbye, but not the kind of goodbye you say when you're dying, the kind you say when you're leaving. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his notes. Listen to this. On the track titled Blasphemy, he says something about his enemies thinking they've won, but he'll be back when they least expect it. On another track, he talks about watching from the shadows. These could just be tough guy posturing, sure, but they could also be someone telling you exactly what they're about to do, hiding the truth in plain sight where no one will believe it. Ava made notes, her hand cramping from writing so fast. The pieces were interesting, but they weren't proof. They were the kinds of details that fueled speculation but didn't constitute evidence. She needed something harder, something tangible, something that couldn't be dismissed as interpretation or wishful thinking. That's when she found the police memo. Aced 2, a secret going cold. The document was buried in a batch of declassified Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department records released under a Freedom of Information Act request, filed by a journalist back in 2015. Most of the files were routine incident reports and administrative paperwork, the bureaucratic debris of the police department handling thousands of cases. But one memo stood out. It was dated September 14th, 1996, the day after Tupac's death was announced. The memo was addressed to the department's media relations office and contained instructions for handling press inquiries about the case. One line jumped off the page, highlighted in yellow marker by whoever had previously reviewed these files. No body photographs to be released under any circumstances, no public casket footage authorised. Family has requested complete privacy during viewing and service. Comply immediately. Ava stared at the screen until her eyes burned. The wording was unusual. Police departments typically release some kind of confirmation in high-profile death cases, even if just procedural details. Death certificates, cause of death, basic autopsy findings. But this seemed designed to create a complete blackout of visual evidence. The phrase, "comply immediately," suggested urgency that went beyond normal family privacy requests. She decided to visit University Medical Center herself. The hospital was a sprawling complex in downtown Las Vegas, a fortress of concrete and glass that loomed over the surrounding neighborhood. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Ava crossed the parking lot, heat radiating up from the asphalt in shimmering waves. Inside, the air conditioning was almost aggressive, cold enough to make her shiver after the blast furnace of the parking lot. The place had that universal hospital smell, antiseptic and floor wax, and something underneath that was probably fear and grief mixed together. Ava walked through the main entrance, trying to look like she belonged there, her press credentials tucked into her bag just in case, a folder full of fake paperwork visible in her arms to make her seem official. She found the records department tucked away on the second floor, down a corridor that seemed designed to discourage casual visitors. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, one of them flickering intermittently. A security camera watched from the corner, its red light, blinking steadily. The door was marked Medical Records, Authorised Personnel Only. She knocked and entered before anyone could tell her not to. Inside, a clerk sat behind a desk buried in manila folders and outdated computer equipment. He was in his 40s, balding. with the exhausted expression of someone who spent their days dealing with bureaucratic requests from lawyers and insurance companies. He looked up when she entered, his expression shifting immediately to professional wariness. "Can I help you?" His tone suggested he very much hoped he couldn't. Ava put on her most professional smile and submitted a formal request for patient exit logs from September 1996, specifically for Ward B, where critical care patients were housed. She had prepared a story about researching hospital procedures for a medical journalism piece, but she never got to use it. The clerk looked at her request and shook his head almost immediately, not even pretending to check any systems. "Privacy laws," he said flatly, pushing the paper back toward her. "Medical records from that time period are sealed, even patient logs. You'd need a court order or family authorization." "What if the patient is deceased?" Ava asked, knowing the answer but wanting to see his reaction. "Still sealed, hospital policy." He crossed his arms, making it clear the conversation was over. "Even after almost 30 years? Ma'am, those records could stay sealed for 50 years or more. It doesn't matter how long it's been. Without proper authorization, I can't help you." He paused, then added in a lower voice, "And between you and me, some records are sealed for reasons that go beyond normal privacy laws. If you're asking about who I think you're asking about, that file has been flagged since 1996. Federal seal. That means someone in Washington decided no one gets to see it without going through them first." Ava felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the office. "Federal seal? For what reason?" The clerk shrugged. "Above my pay grade. Could be witness protection, could be national security, could be a dozen other things. All I know is that file doesn't exist as far as this department is concerned." She thanked him and left, frustrated but not surprised. She had expected resistance. The question was whether that resistance was standard procedure or something more deliberate. The mention of a federal seal was interesting. What would trigger federal involvement in a gang-related shooting? That evening, back in her hotel room, she began researching the online presence of conspiracy theorists who claimed to have evidence of Tupac's survival. One name kept appearing in forum discussions: Michael A., a man living in Belize who posted occasional videos online with his face blurred out, claiming he had encountered someone matching Tupac's description in the small island town of San Pedro years ago. Most people dismissed him as a crank seeking attention. But Ava noticed something in his videos. The details were too specific to be complete fabrications. He described the tattoos accurately, including ones that weren't widely photographed, like the smaller designs on Tupac's hands and the exact placement of every element. He knew about Tupac's mannerisms, the way he tilted his head when he listened, the specific cadence of his speech, the habit of touching his chin when he was thinking. Either this man had done extensive research that went beyond what any normal fan would attempt, or he had actually met someone who knew these details intimately. Ava made a decision. She booked a flight to Belize, leaving the next morning. She arrived in early July, stepping off the plane into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through a wet towel. The small airport in Belize City was a chaos of tourists, locals, taxi drivers shouting destinations, and the overwhelming smell of tropical vegetation and salt water. She had created a cover story. She was a travel writer doing a piece on Central American island culture. She didn't want to attract attention by announcing she was investigating Tupac sightings. The ride to San Pedro took her on a small ferry that bounced across turquoise water so clear she could see fish swimming beneath the hull. The town itself was a collection of pastel-coloured buildings on stilts, sandy streets where golf carts outnumbered cars, and an atmosphere of deliberate disconnection from the rest of the world. This was the kind of place people came when they wanted to disappear. She spent 3 days making casual inquiries at local bars and restaurants, nursing beers and striking up conversations with bartenders and shopkeepers. Most people were friendly, but unhelpful, offering the practiced vagueness of islanders who had learned not to ask questions about the tourists and expats who drifted through. A few locals seemed uncomfortable when she mentioned seeing an American man with tattoos who had been in the area years ago. One bartender told her, "People come here to disappear. We don't ask questions. Bad for business." But on her third day, she met an older woman named Rosa, who ran a small guest house on Caye Caulker, a nearby island even more remote than San Pedro. Rosa was in her 60s, weathered by sun and salt, with eyes that had seen enough of life to be cautious but curious. They sat on Rosa's porch overlooking the water, drinking strong coffee, while pelicans dove for fish in the shallows. When Ava mentioned she was researching American expats who had settled in Belize in the late 1990s, Rosa's eyes lit up with recognition. "I remember one man," Rosa said carefully, as if testing each word before releasing it. "This was a long time ago, maybe 20 years or more. He stayed here for a few weeks, never gave his real name, just called himself T, paid cash always, very particular about that. Kept to himself mostly, but he was polite, good tipper, but you could see he was watching everything, you know, like a man who expects trouble." "What did he look like?" Ava asked, trying to keep her voice casual while her heart hammered against her ribs. Rosa leaned back in her chair, eyes distant with memory. Tall, strong-built, dark skin, and tattooed. Oh my God, tattooed everywhere. His arms, his chest. I saw them when he was swimming. He went swimming at night usually, when the beach was empty, and his face, I knew I had seen it before, on TV maybe, or magazine, but I couldn't place it. My daughter, she was maybe 15 then, she said to me one day, "Mama, that man looks like that rapper, the one who got shot." And I told her, "No, Mia, that man is dead." But after she said it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. "What happened to him?" Ava asked, leaning forward. Rosa shrugged, her expression darkening slightly. "He left one morning, early, before sunrise. I saw him go because I was up making breakfast. A boat came for him, not the regular ferry. Private boat, expensive looking. 3 men on it, all business. They didn't come to shore. He waded out to them with his bag held over his head. Then they were gone, heading south along the coast. I never saw him again." "Do you remember anything else? Anything he said, or anything unusual about his stay?" Rosa thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "One thing, he had a jar with him. Glass jar, like for preserving food, but sealed with wax. He kept it wrapped in a towel in his room. I saw it once when I was cleaning. Inside the jar was something dark, like ashes or dirt. I asked him about it, and he said it was sacred. From home, that's all he would say. One jar." Ava felt electricity course through her. The cryptic message from the anonymous email suddenly made more sense. One jar wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. But what was in it? And why was it important enough to mention alongside the other clues? Back in her hotel room that night, she reviewed documents she had obtained through less official channels. A source in Las Vegas, a former emergency services dispatcher who had helped her for a previous story about EMT protocols, had sent her copies of ambulance run logs from September 7th, 1996. Most of the entries were routine: heart attacks, car accidents, drug overdoses. Each one had a patient number, a timestamp, a basic description of injuries, and a destination. But one entry stood out like a sore thumb. Patient 1724, transferred, VIP code 3, no name recorded, personal effects, 1 sealed glass container, contents unknown, VIP code 3. Ava researched what that meant and found that it was a designation used for high-profile patients requiring maximum security and privacy. Celebrities, politicians, witnesses in federal cases, the kind of people whose presence in a hospital could create chaos if it became public knowledge. But why no name? Every other entry in the log, even other VIP cases, had at least initials or a case number that could be cross-referenced with hospital admission records. This one was blank, and the personal effects line, 1 sealed glass container, just like Rosa had described, just like the anonymous email had hinted at. What was in that jar? And why had it travelled with Tupac from Las Vegas to Belize? She compared the timestamp. The ambulance run for patient 1724 occurred at 11:17 at night on September 7th. That matched the time frame of Tupac's shooting. But the transfer notation was what caught her attention. Transferred where? And why would that detail be omitted from an official record? Ava sat at her laptop deep into the night, the sound of waves crashing on the shore mixing with the whir of her computer fan. She was getting close to something. She could feel it the way you could feel a storm coming before the first drops of rain fell. The pattern was there. The evidence was mounting. But she still didn't have the whole picture. She needed to understand who had the means and motive to help Tupac disappear. She needed to follow the money. She needed to find out what was in that jar. Act 3. The grounds for fake death. Ava returned to Las Vegas with more questions than answers, but at least now they were the right questions. She needed to understand the context better, to map the ecosystem of power and money and violence that surrounded Tupac in the weeks before his death. Who had the means and motive to help him fake his death? Who stood to gain, and who stood to lose? She started with Marion Soog Knight. Knight was the CEO of Death Row Records, the label that had made Tupac a superstar and generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. He was also a former college football player with alleged ties to the Bloods gang, and a reputation for intimidation and violence that was legendary even by music industry standards. Stories about him were everywhere, dangling Vanilla Ice off a balcony to secure publishing rights, assaulting people at industry events, running Death Row like a criminal enterprise with platinum plaques on the walls. He had been in the car with Tupac when the shooting happened, sitting in the driver's seat of the black BMW that had rolled to a stop after the white Cadillac pulled alongside them at the red light. He had walked away with barely a scratch while Tupac had taken 4 bullets. That fact alone had made Knight a suspect in some conspiracy theories, people claiming he had orchestrated the hit over contract disputes and money. But Ava found that theory didn't quite fit when she really dug into the financials. Knight needed Tupac alive. The rapper was Death Row's biggest asset, bigger even than Snoop Dogg or the rest of the roster. His album sold millions. His cultural impact was immeasurable. All Eyes on Me had gone diamond. The Machiavelli album was tracking to go multi-platinum, even though it released after his death. Killing. Tupac made no financial sense when the man was actively generating tens of millions of dollars in revenue. But helping him disappear? That was a different calculation entirely. Ava spent a week in Los Angeles, digging into Death Row's financial records from that period. She pieced together information from court documents, bankruptcy filings that came years later when the label finally imploded, and interviews with former employees who were willing to talk now that Knight was serving time in prison for an unrelated manslaughter charge. The picture that emerged was troubling. Death Row Records in 1996 was a powder keg wrapped in platinum records. The label was bringing in massive revenue, but it was also bleeding money through mismanagement, legal fees, and what one accountant called off-book expenses that were almost certainly money laundering for gang operations. Federal investigators were circling, looking into racketeering and organised crime connections. The FBI had opened files on multiple Death Row executives. Gang affiliations that had once been useful for street credibility were becoming serious legal liabilities, and Tupac himself had been growing increasingly vocal about wanting to leave Death Row and start his own label. He had signed with Death Row while in prison, desperate for the $1 million bail Knight had posted. But now that he was out, now that he had fulfilled his contract obligations, he was looking for an exit. The problem was that Knight didn't let people leave. Not alive anyway. Too many people knew too much about how Death Row really operated. What if the shooting had been real, but the death had been staged? What if Knight had seen an opportunity to get Tupac out of the line of fire, while also protecting the label's most valuable brand, and keeping federal investigators from getting their hands on a cooperating witness? A dead Tupac was worth more than a living one in some ways. No more legal troubles, no more unpredictable behaviour, No more risk of him testifying about death row's operations or jumping to a competitor. Just a legacy that could be monetized forever without any of the complications of dealing with the actual human being. Ava found something else interesting when she interviewed a forensics expert who specialised in death certificates and autopsy reports. The expert, a retired county coroner named Patricia Williams, who had handled thousands of cases during her career, agreed to review what little public information existed about Tupac's autopsy. They met at Williams' home in San Diego, a modest house filled with medical textbooks and forensic journals. Williams was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and sceptical by nature, someone who had spent a career dealing with families who didn't want to accept how their loved ones had died. "The thing about the Tupac case that always bothered me," Williams said, spreading out copies of the limited autopsy findings on her dining room table, "is that for such a high-profile death, there's remarkably little documentation available. Usually celebrity deaths get exhaustive examination because everyone wants to avoid even a hint of impropriety. But here, the full autopsy report was sealed, with only the most basic details released. That's unusual." "Could there be legitimate reasons for sealing it?" Ava asked. Williams nodded. "Sure. Family privacy, ongoing investigation, all the usual reasons. But it's been almost 30 years. Most sealed documents get released eventually, even if it takes decades. This one hasn't budged. That tells me someone with serious influence wants it to stay sealed." "What about the cremation? I've read that the body was cremated very quickly after the funeral." "Within 24 hours, Williams confirmed. "Again, not impossible, but fast. Cremation destroys all physical evidence. Once you burn a body, you can't go back and retest for toxicology, can't examine wound patterns, can't verify identity through DNA. It's final in a way that burial isn't. So if someone wanted to fake a death, cremation would be the way to do it?" Williams leaned back in her chair, considering her words carefully. "I'm not saying that's what happened, but if I were writing a manual on how to fake a celebrity death, yes, I would include immediate cremation on the checklist, along with a closed casket funeral, limited autopsy release and quick disposal of any physical evidence that could be independently verified later." Ava made detailed notes. The pattern kept repeating. Every procedural decision made in the days after Tupac's shooting had the effect of making verification impossible. Maybe that was coincidence, or maybe it was design. The funeral itself had been unusually private for someone of Tupac's celebrity status. The memorial service at the Frankie Campbell Funeral Chapel in New York was closed to media for the first hour, with only family and close friends allowed inside. Security was tight, enforced by men who looked more like bodyguards than funeral home staff. By the time reporters were permitted entry for the public viewing, the casket was already closed, sealed with brass screws. No one outside the immediate family ever saw Tupac's body except, allegedly, the medical examiner and the mortician. But Ava had found something interesting about that mortician. His name was Charles Henderson, and he had worked for the funeral home for 3 decades, handling services for everyone from mob bosses to mayors. She tracked him down to a retirement community in Florida, where he agreed to speak with her on condition that she didn't record the conversation. Henderson was 82 now, frail but mentally sharp. They sat in his small apartment while he drank iced tea and talked about a career spent preparing dead bodies for their final public appearances. "I remember the Shakur service," he said quietly. "How could I forget? It was chaos, security everywhere, family members crying, fans outside the building screaming. The pressure was intense to handle everything perfectly." "Do you remember preparing the body?" Ava asked, keeping her voice gentle. Henderson was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I signed confidentiality agreements, multiple agreements, more paperwork than I'd ever seen for a funeral service. They told me if I ever spoke about what I saw, I could be sued for everything I owned." "It's been 30 years, Ava said. "Whatever you signed probably has limitations." "Maybe." He looked out the window at the Florida sunshine, his expression distant. All I'll say is this. In my career, I prepared thousands of bodies. I knew what gunshot wounds looked like. I knew what a body looked like after 6 days in intensive care, after multiple surgeries, after fighting for life and losing. And what I prepared for that service didn't match what the medical records described. That's all I can say. Draw your own conclusions. Ava's hands trembled as she wrote down his words. It wasn't a confession, but it was close. Close enough to confirm what she had begun to suspect. The body in that casket hadn't been Tupac. But if that was true, where was the real Tupac? And what did the jar have to do with anything? She found a possible answer in the culture of hip-hop itself. After extensive research and consultation with cultural anthropologists, she discovered that carrying ash or earth from your homeland was a practice in some African and Caribbean cultures, a way of maintaining connection to your roots even when far from home. Tupac's mother, Afeni, had been a Black Panther with strong ties to revolutionary movements and African spiritual practices. She had raised her son with a deep awareness of African heritage and the importance of maintaining cultural identity even in diaspora. What if the jar contained ash from somewhere significant to Tupac? What if it was part of a ritual, a symbolic carrying of his identity to his new life? In some traditions, carrying earth from your birthplace or a sacred place was believed to protect the traveller and maintain their connection to their ancestors. The anonymous emailer had mentioned it specifically, one jar. As if the jar itself was proof, evidence of the plan, a tangible object that connected the shooting in Las Vegas to the man in Belize to whatever life Tupac might be living now. If Tupac had truly planned to fake his death and start a new life, bringing that jar would make sense. It would be a way of carrying his true self into exile, a spiritual anchor in a life built on lies and false identities. Ava needed to find that jar. But first, she needed to understand the full scope of the escape plan. She continued tracking shipping records. After another week of tedious research, multiple Freedom of Information requests, and help from her source inside the port of Los Angeles, she found what she was looking for. In late September 1996, several large crates labelled Equipment Audiovisual Promo were shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City, Florida. The shipment was registered to a company called Eagle Shadow Logistics, a firm that had no website, no public business listings, and no record of existence after 1997. Eagle Shadow. The same phrase from the anonymous email that had started this investigation 3 months ago. The crates themselves were large enough to hold studio equipment, which made the shipment seem routine at first glance. Death Row regularly shipped recording equipment to various locations for promotional events and studio sessions. But Ava noticed something odd about the timing. The shipment was processed on September 10th, just 3 days before Tupac was officially pronounced dead, and the destination, Panama City, was a coastal hub with easy access to Central and South America by boat. The shipping manifest listed the contents as audio mixing boards, microphones, amplifiers, with a declared value that seemed suspiciously low for that much equipment. The total weight was listed as over 800 pounds, but the freight cost was minimal, suggesting someone with connections in the shipping industry had helped facilitate the transfer without too much scrutiny. She began to see the outline of a plan that was audacious in its scope but possible with the right resources and connections, and Marion Knight, whatever else he was, had both resources and connections in abundance. ECT-4, the escape plan. Ava constructed a timeline based on everything she had gathered. It was speculative, she knew, but it fit the available evidence better than the official story. September 7th, 11:17 at night. Tupac is shot 4 times in a drive-by shooting on the Las Vegas Strip. He's rushed to University Medical Center in critical condition. The shooting is real. The wounds are life-threatening, but he survives the initial trauma. September 8th and 9th, Tupac undergoes surgery. His right lung is removed. He is placed in intensive care. The official story says he remained in the hospital fighting for his life. But what if something else happened during this time? Ava found a notation in the hospital record she'd obtained, a single line that appeared in the ICU log for September 9th. Patient transferred to secure site. Identity withheld per federal protocol. Federal protocol. That suggested law enforcement or government involvement. Witness protection, maybe? Or something less official? September 10th. Early morning hours. Ava's theory diverged sharply from the official narrative at this point. She believed that Tupac was transferred out of University Medical Center under heavy security in the middle of the night. In his place, a body was prepared for eventual public display, a body similar enough in age and race to pass a cursory examination, but one that would never be subjected to close scrutiny because it would be cremated within days. The real Tupac, injured but stable, was transported to a private airfield outside Las Vegas. Ava had found a flight log that supported this theory. A small charter aircraft registered to an escrow company called Eagle Shadow Holdings departed from a private terminal at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport on September 10th at 6:15 in the morning. The flight plan listed the destination as Belize City International Airport. The passenger manifest showed 3 individuals, but their names were redacted in the copy she obtained. September 13th. Tupac Shakur is officially pronounced dead at University Medical Center. The announcement is made to the media. The world mourns. The conspiracy theories begin immediately, but most people dismiss them as grief-fueled denial. Meanwhile, if Ava's theory was correct, the real Tupac was recovering in a safe house in Belize, thousands of miles from the media circus and the gang violence that had nearly killed him. She returned to Belize in late July to follow up on the flight log. The private airfield where the plane would have landed was now defunct, converted to commercial use. But she tracked down a former air traffic controller who'd worked there in the 90s. His name was Carlos, and he agreed to meet her at a cafe in Belize City. He was in his 60s now, retired, and seemed amused by her questions. "You're not the first person to ask about that time," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. There was a flight, September 1996. I remember because it was unusual. Middle of the night, no advance notice, and when the plane landed there were men with guns waiting. Security, I assumed. Private contractors. "Did you see the passengers?" Ava asked. Carlos nodded slowly. 3 people got off the plane. 2 were large men, bodyguards maybe. The third was smaller, wrapped in blankets, moving slowly like he was hurt. They put him in a car and drove away very fast. I never saw where they went. "Did you see his face?" "No, but I saw his arm when the blanket slipped, covered in tattoos, very distinctive. I remembered thinking he must be someone important to have that kind of security." Ava felt a chill run through her. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was another piece that fit the puzzle. She also discovered something else during her research. In early 1997, just a few months after Tupac's death, a trust was established in Malaysia under the name Tariq Amaru. The trust documents, which she obtained through a contact in international finance, listed Tupac Amaru Shakur Trust as the beneficiary entity. The trust was designed to hold and distribute assets, including intellectual property rights and royalty payments. Tariq Amaru, almost an anagram of Tupac Amaru, too close to be coincidence. When she contacted the law firm managing the trust, she received a terse response. File sealed for privacy. No comment. Act 5. The risks of remaining dead. Ava sat in her apartment in Los Angeles, surrounded by evidence boards and timelines pinned to the walls. Papers were everywhere, spreading from her desk to the floor to the kitchen counter. Coffee cups formed rings on documents. Post-it notes covered every surface with questions, connections, and letters to follow. She had been investigating for 3 months now, and the weight of what she had uncovered was becoming overwhelming. She wasn't just chasing a conspiracy theory anymore. She was reconstructing what might be one of the most elaborate deceptions in modern celebrity history. But she kept asking herself the same question. Why? Why would Tupac choose to remain dead if he had survived? The answer, she realised, came down to survival and legacy. The threats against Tupac in 1996 were very real and came from every direction. The East Coast versus West Coast hip-hop rivalry had escalated from lyrical battles into actual violence, with shots fired at industry events and real blood spilled on city streets. The notorious Big, Tupac's childhood friend turned bitter rival, would be murdered just 6 months after Tupac's death in a still unsolved shooting eerily similar to the one that had nearly killed Tupac. That murder would remain unsolved too, suggesting the same forces that wanted Tupac dead had succeeded with his former friend. Gang affiliations that had once been just street credibility had become serious liabilities. Tupac's association with the Bloods through Death Row Records put him in the crosshairs of their rivals. His outspoken nature, his refusal to back down from confrontation, his tendency to turn every slight into a public feud, had made him enemies in the music industry, in law enforcement, and on the streets. He had been shot multiple times before the Las Vegas incident. He had been arrested repeatedly. He had served time in prison. The walls were closing in from every side. Staying dead meant staying safe. It meant his enemies would stop looking for him. It meant he could live out his life without constantly watching over his shoulder, without worrying that every corner he turned might be his last, without wondering if the next car that pulled up beside him would be the one that finished what the white Cadillac had started. There was also the matter of his commercial legacy. Tupac alive and aging would have been just another rapper trying to stay relevant in a changing industry, competing with younger artists, watching his influence fade as new styles and sounds took over. He would have had to deal with the mundane realities of a music career, contract negotiations, marketing decisions, the slow decline that came for every artist eventually. But Tupac, dead at 25, became immortal. His albums continued to sell millions of copies. Unreleased material was packaged and released for years after his death, generating revenue that would have made him one of the wealthiest figures in hip-hop if he had lived to collect it. His image appeared on t-shirts, posters, murals. His lyrics were quoted in college courses. He became more than a rapper. He became an icon, a martyr, a symbol of everything the culture represented. The question was, did he collect it? Ava found evidence suggesting that someone was managing Tupac's estate in ways that didn't quite make sense if he was actually dead. The Trikamaru Trust in Malaysia was just the beginning. She discovered real estate purchases in New Mexico under shell companies with names that referenced Tupac's aliases and lyrics. She found bank transfers moving money through accounts in Cuba, a country where Americans were restricted from doing business, but where Tupac's mother, Afeni, had known political connections through her work with political refugees and revolutionary movements. One purchase in particular caught her attention, a property in rural New Mexico near a Navajo reservation, acquired in 1998 by a company called Machiavelli Holdings. The property was remote, off-grid, and completely private. Satellite imagery showed a compound with multiple buildings, solar panels, and enough land to be completely self-sufficient. Public records showed it was still owned by the same company, with property taxes paid regularly every year. Someone was maintaining that property. Someone was living there, or at least keeping it operational. Who was paying those taxes? Who owned Machiavelli Holdings? The corporate filings led to another shell company registered in Delaware, which led to another registered in the Cayman Islands, which led to another in Panama, creating a web of legal entities designed to obscure the ultimate owner. It was the kind of corporate structure used by people who had something serious to hide. Ava spent 2 weeks trying to unravel the ownership chain. She paid for specialised database searches. She contacted corporate attorneys who specialised in international business law. She followed money trails through offshore accounts and dummy corporations, and at the end of it all she found that the trail led back to a single point of origin. a trust established in 1997, just months after Tupac's death, with instructions that the beneficial owner's identity would remain sealed until the year 2045, nearly 50 years after the trust's creation. Who sets up a trust that locks identity information for 50 years unless they have something massive to hide? She also discovered something interesting about Tupac's posthumous releases. Between 1996 and 2006, 7 full albums of Tupac's music were released. Some were compilations of old material, remixes, and alternate versions of songs that had appeared on earlier albums. But others contained songs that had never been heard before. Tracks that nobody in the industry could account for based on known recording sessions. The official explanation was that Tupac had been incredibly prolific during his short career, recording hundreds of tracks that were being released gradually after his death, as his estate and label worked through the archive. Death Row and later Amaru Entertainment, the label Afeni had formed to control her son's legacy, claimed they had vaults full of unreleased material. But some audio engineers who analysed the posthumous tracks told a different story. Ava interviewed 3 different audio forensics experts, professionals who worked with law enforcement to verify voice recordings and detect audio manipulation. They pointed to subtle differences in recording quality, production techniques, and even vocal patterns that suggested some of the later tracks might have been recorded after Tupac's official death date. "Listen to the background noise on some of these tracks," one engineer told her, playing sections of a posthumous album through professional monitoring equipment. "The ambient sound signature doesn't match Death Row Studios or any other facility we can verify Tupac recorded at, and the vocal quality is different. Not worse, just different. Like he was recording in a different environment, maybe even using different equipment." Another engineer pointed out inconsistencies in Tupac's voice itself. The timbre and resonance patterns on some of these later tracks suggest his vocal cords had fully matured, that he had aged past 25. It's subtle, but it's there. The voice has more depth, more resonance in the lower registers. That's not something you can fake with production tricks. The theories were dismissed as conspiracy nonsense by most music industry professionals. Death Row and Amaru Entertainment released statements saying all the posthumous material had been recorded before Tupac's death. Music critics called the audio forensics claims pseudoscience. But Ava wondered if there was more to it. What if Tupac hadn't just faked his death? What if he had continued recording music in secret, feeding new material to his estate to be released gradually, maintaining his presence in the culture without revealing himself? It would explain how the posthumous releases kept coming year after year, without the quality declining or the material running out. It would explain the inconsistencies the audio engineers had noticed. It would explain why his estate seemed so carefully managed, as if someone with intimate knowledge of his artistic vision was still making decisions about which tracks to release and when. It would be an extraordinary level of deception, requiring careful coordination between Tupac, his mother, trusted engineers and producers, and possibly even law enforcement or intelligence agencies. But then again, Tupac had been an extraordinary figure, a poet, an actor, a revolutionary thinker who had read Machiavelli in prison and understood that sometimes the greatest power came from appearing powerless, from being dead while actually alive, from controlling your legacy by removing yourself from it entirely. If anyone could pull off a deception that elaborate, it would be Tupac Amaru Shakur. Aced 6. The decision point. By late August, Ava had compiled everything she'd gathered into a comprehensive report that ran over 100 pages. She had the ambulance logs with their mysterious VIP Code 3 and personal effects listing. She had the shipping records for Eagle Shadow Logistics. She had the flight manifest showing a charter plane leaving Las Vegas for Belize the morning after the shooting. She had the trust documents from Malaysia. She had witness testimonies from Rosa in Belize and Carlos, the air traffic controller. She had the statement from Charles Henderson, the mortician who had prepared a body that didn't match the medical records. She had the audio forensics suggesting posthumous tracks were recorded after Tupac's death. and she had the strange gaps in the official narrative that had never been adequately explained. Most importantly, she had traced the mystery of the jar. The sealed glass container mentioned in the ambulance log, the jar Rosa had seen in Belize, the symbolic carrying of sacred earth from home. It all connected. The jar was physical evidence that tied everything together, proof that someone matching Tupac's description had travelled from Las Vegas to Belize carrying something deeply personal, something connected to his identity and heritage. She knew that publishing this story would make her a target. She knew that powerful people had reasons to keep the truth hidden, whatever that truth actually was. Death Row Records might be defunct, but Marion Knight still had connections. The people who had helped fake Tupac's death, if that's what had happened, wouldn't want their roles exposed. And if federal agencies had been involved, which the sealed files suggested, then she would be challenging forces far more dangerous than any record label executive. But she also knew that journalism existed for moments like this, for stories that challenged official narratives and forced difficult questions into the public sphere. This was why she had become a reporter, not to write puff pieces about album releases, but to uncover truth that powerful people wanted buried. She decided to do something bold. Rather than publishing a traditional article that could be ignored or dismissed, she would host a live-streamed presentation where she revealed her findings in real time, allowing the audience to see the evidence and draw their own conclusions. A live stream couldn't be stopped once it started. It couldn't be edited or suppressed by editors worried about lawsuits. And if thousands of people watched it happen in real time, the information couldn't be disappeared even if something happened to her afterward. She spent a week preparing. She created a PowerPoint presentation with scanned documents, photographs, and audio, clips. She rehearsed her delivery until she could present the entire investigation clearly and compellingly. She set up multiple backup servers to host the stream, knowing that whoever wanted this buried might try to take her offline. She notified several trusted journalist friends about the stream time, asking them to save copies in case her originals disappeared. The stream was scheduled for August 22nd, 2025, at 8 in the evening Pacific time. She promoted it on social media for 3 days beforehand with cryptic messages. The truth about Tupac Shakur. 29 years of lies end Thursday night. What really happened in Las Vegas? The anticipation built. Hip-hop forums exploded with speculation. Music news sites picked up the story. By the day of the stream, she had over 50,000 people registered to watch. The stream went live at 8 sharp. Within minutes, the viewer count climbed past 100,000. Within half an hour, it had gone viral, shared across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit. News outlets started covering it in real time. By the time she was an hour into her presentation, over 1 million people were watching. Ava sat in front of her camera, her apartment's evidence board visible behind her, and walked through her investigation step by step. She started with the anonymous email that had begun everything, explaining the cryptic message: "Follow the eagle's shadow, Las Vegas, September 7th, 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar." "I followed that shadow," she told the camera, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "And what I found raises questions that have never been properly answered about the death of the most influential rapper of his generation." She showed the ambulance log with patient 1724 and VIP code 3. She zoomed in on the line about personal effects, 1 sealed glass container. "This jar appears again in Belize," she explained, carried by a man matching Tupac's description, who told a guest house owner it contained something sacred from home. In some African and Caribbean cultures, carrying earth or ash from your homeland is a way of maintaining spiritual connection when in exile. Was Tupac carrying a piece of himself into his new life? She displayed the shipping manifest for Eagle Shadow Logistics, highlighting the timing. Equipment shipped from Los Angeles to Panama City 3 days before Tupac was pronounced dead. The same company name that appeared in the anonymous email. A company that ceased to exist after 1997. She played audio from her interview with the former death row security guard, his voice disguised for protection. I heard someone mention extraction and Latin America branch. People don't use that language for moving studio equipment. They use it for moving people. She showed photographs of the property in New Mexico, obtained through public records requests and satellite imagery. A compound owned by Machiavelli Holdings, maintained for over 25 years, purchased through a web of shell companies designed to hide the true owner. Who's living there? Who's been paying the property taxes for a quarter century? She explained the web of trusts and offshore accounts, the money flowing through Cuba and Malaysia, the corporate structures designed for maximum secrecy. This isn't how you manage the estate of a dead celebrity. This is how you hide a living person's financial activity. She played the audio forensics analysis, letting viewers hear the subtle differences in vocal resonance on posthumous tracks. 3 independent audio engineers have told me these tracks show signs of being recorded years after Tupac's official death date. The music industry dismissed their findings, but science doesn't lie. She discussed the Belize sightings in detail, showing photographs Rosa had taken of the beach, where the tattooed man had swum at night. The testimony from Carlos about the mysterious flight and the injured passenger with distinctive tattoos. Multiple witnesses, decades apart, telling consistent stories about a man who looked like Tupac, had his tattoos, his mannerisms, his voice. Then she dropped the biggest bombshell, her interview with Charles Henderson, the mortician. She didn't show his face or use his name, but she quoted him directly. In his career, preparing thousands of bodies, he knew what gunshot wounds looked like, and what he prepared for Tupac's funeral didn't match the medical records. That's not speculation. That's the professional assessment of someone who handled the body. She paused, letting that sink in for her massive audience. I am not saying definitively that Tupac Shakur is alive, she told the camera, looking directly into the lens. What I'm saying is that there are too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies, too many pieces of evidence that don't fit the official story. Whether Tupac survived or not, something happened that night, and in the days that followed that we have not been told about. Someone went to great lengths to make verification impossible. The cremation, the sealed autopsy, the closed casket, the federal seals on hospital records. That's not how innocent people behave. That's not how you handle a straightforward case of gang violence. She ended with a direct appeal, her voice rising with passion. If the most iconic figure in hip-hop history faked his death, it raises fundamental questions about truth, identity, power, and the manipulation of public narrative. These are questions we should be asking about our culture, about the industry, about what we believe and why we believe it. How many other stories have we accepted without examination? How many other legends are built on lies? And if Tupac Shakur did survive, if he's out there somewhere living under a different name, does he deserve the peace he's found? Or does the public have a right to know the truth? The stream ended after 2 hours and 15 minutes. The chat had been scrolling too fast to read, thousands of messages per second. The viewer count had peaked at over 2 million people watching simultaneously. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Social media exploded with debate. Hashtags trended worldwide. Tupac lives, Machiavelli returns, Ava Ramirez. Some called her a hero for investigative journalism, a truth-teller who had done what mainstream media was too cowardly or compromised to attempt. Others called her a fraud peddling conspiracy theories for clicks, a clout chaser exploiting a dead man's legacy for personal gain. Major news outlets reached out for interviews. Her website crashed from traffic within minutes, even with the backup servers running. By morning, she had over 100 media requests in her inbox, and then the threat started. At first, they were generic trolling, the kind of harassment any woman with a public platform receives, but within 24 hours they became specific and credible. Her email inbox filled with anonymous messages warning her to stop digging, containing details about her daily routine that proved someone was watching her. Her home address was posted on multiple forums. Her social media accounts were flooded with harassment so intense she had to disable comments entirely. Someone sent her a package at her apartment building. When she opened it, she found a printed photo of her building taken from across the street, with a red X drawn over her window in marker. No note, no explanation, just the image and the implication. 2 days after the stream, her website was hit with a massive distributed denial of service attack that took it offline for 3 days. Her hosting provider told her it was one of the most sophisticated attacks they had ever seen, originating from multiple countries simultaneously, using methods typically associated with state-sponsored hacking groups. This isn't random hacktivists, the security specialist told her. Someone with serious resources wants you silenced. Most troubling of all, her contact in Belize, Michael Agas, went completely silent. His videos stopped appearing online. His email bounced back with a message saying the account didn't exist. When she tried to reach out to mutual contacts in San Pedro, they told her he had left the country suddenly, in the middle of the night, leaving his belongings behind. One person said they'd seen men in suits asking about him at the bars where he used to hang out. Another said they heard a boat had picked him up from the beach and headed south toward Guatemala. Rosa, the guest house owner who had told her about the tattooed man with the jar, stopped returning her calls. When Ava finally reached her daughter, she was told, "My mother says she doesn't want to talk anymore. She says the past should stay in the past. Please don't contact us again." Carlos, the air traffic controller in Belize City, sent her a single text message. "They know I talked to you. I'm sorry. I can't help anymore. Delete my number." One by one, her sources were disappearing or being silenced. Ava realised she'd kicked a hornet's nest. Someone was very interested in making sure her investigation didn't go any further. The question was, who? And how far would they go to protect a secret that was almost 30 years old? She didn't sleep for 3 days after the stream, jumping at every sound in her apartment building, checking the locks on her door obsessively, keeping a baseball bat by her bed. She knew she should be scared. She was scared. But she also felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She had done something that mattered. She had asked questions that needed asking, and whatever happened next, at least she had told the truth as best she could determine it. Or at least she had raised enough doubt about the official story that people would never look at Tupac's death the same way again. Epilogue. It was late September now, almost exactly 29 years since Tupac had been shot on the Las Vegas Strip. Ava sat in a hotel room in Miami, far from her apartment in Los Angeles, which no longer felt safe. The room was generic, the kind of anonymous space that existed in every city. Beige walls, generic art prints, the smell of industrial cleaning products trying to mask decades of previous occupants. She had checked in under a fake name, paid cash, and told no one where she was going. She had backed up all her files to secure cloud storage, encrypted everything twice, and shared copies with 3 trusted journalists she had worked with over the years, people who would publish the material if anything happened to her. She had written detailed instructions about where all her sources were, how to verify the evidence, who to contact if she went silent. It was the kind of preparation you made when you knew you had become a target. The threats hadn't stopped. If anything, they had intensified. But she was still alive, still working, still digging. That had to count for something. She opened her laptop and scrolled through Reddit threads, watching the conspiracy community react to her revelations. The discussions had exploded across multiple forums and platforms. The documentary subreddit had a mega thread with over 15,000 comments analysing every piece of evidence she had presented. Hip-hop forums were debating whether the audio forensics proved anything, or were just wishful thinking dressed up as science. True crime communities were cross-referencing her findings with other cold cases, looking for patterns. People were sharing their own theories, their own sightings, their own pieces of evidence that they claimed supported her investigation. Some of it was ridiculous, the kind of obviously fabricated stories that conspiracy theories attracted. But some of it was intriguing. Detailed accounts from people who claimed to have seen someone matching Tupac's. Description in various locations over the years. All of it showed how deeply Tupac's death, or alleged death, had impacted the culture. One thread caught her attention. It was titled Pack in Cuba, Pack in Malaysia, Pack in New Mexico, Mapping the Sightings. Users had created an interactive map showing every reported Tupac sighting since 1996, colour-coded by credibility and cross-referenced with the evidence Ava had presented in her stream. Green markers indicated high-credibility sightings with multiple witnesses or photographic evidence. Yellow markers were possible sightings with limited verification. Red markers were obviously false claims. The map showed clusters in Central America, Southeast Asia, and the American Southwest. The pattern was too consistent to be random chance, but too scattered to prove anything definitive. It was like looking at a constellation and trying to decide if the stars formed a picture, or if your brain was just imposing order on chaos. Ava clicked on a green marker in New Mexico, not far from where she'd identified the Machiavelli Holdings property. The entry described a sighting from 2012 by a local artist who claimed to have met a man at a Navajo reservation who looked remarkably like Tupac, though older and quieter. He spoke about hip-hop like someone who had lived it, the artist wrote. Not like a fan, but like someone who had been in the middle of it all. He mentioned the East Coast, West Coast thing with this sadness in his voice, like he was talking about old friends who had died. When I asked his name, he said to call him Amaru. I didn't think anything of it until later. Amaru, Tupac's middle name, the name used for the Malaysian Trust. A breadcrumb or a coincidence? She switched to a different tab, reading through emails from people who had watched her stream. Most were supportive, thanking her for her courage and her journalism. Some were from people claiming to have additional evidence, though most of those led nowhere when she followed up. A few were from music industry insiders, speaking off the record, telling her she was onto something but to be careful because people had disappeared for asking fewer questions than she had asked. One email stood out. It had arrived that morning from an address that appeared to be randomly generated. The subject line was blank, just like the original anonymous email that had started everything. The message was brief. The jar is still sealed. Some truths are buried for good reason. You've done your part. Now let the legend rest. She stared at the message, trying to parse its meaning. Was it a threat? A warning? Or confirmation from someone who knew the truth? Ava opened her journal, a physical notebook she kept for her own thoughts separate from her digital files. The pages were filled with 3 months of notes, observations, questions that still had no answers. She turned to a blank page and began to write, her hand moving across the paper in the dim light of the hotel room. 3 months ago, I received an anonymous email that changed everything. Follow the eagle's shadow, it said. 2 fates, 1 body, 1 jar. I followed that shadow as far as I could, and I found evidence of something extraordinary. Not proof, but evidence. Enough to know that the official story doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Enough to know that powerful people wanted this buried. Enough to know that the truth, whatever it is, has been hidden for nearly 3 decades. Did Tupac Shakur survive September 7th, 1996? I don't know. I may never know for certain. But I know this. Machiavelli lives in the questions we're afraid to ask, in the narratives we accept without examination, in the spaces between what we're told and what we're allowed to know. He said Machiavelli lives, and if he does, we owe him the truth. Not the comfortable lie of martyrdom, not the sanitized legend of a fallen icon, but the messy, complicated, dangerous truth of a man who might have chosen to disappear rather than die. That truth is worth fighting for, even if it costs me everything. She closed the journal and looked out the hotel window at the Miami skyline. The city glowed in the darkness, millions of lights representing millions of people, each one living their own version of truth and lies. Somewhere out there, in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or Cuba or 1,000 other places, someone might be living under a different name with a different face, but the same tattoos and the same voice and the same fire that had made Tupac Shakur immortal even before his alleged death. Or maybe he really was gone, and she had spent 3 months chasing shadows and connecting dots that didn't actually form a picture. Maybe the pattern she had found was just the human mind's desperate attempt to impose meaning on chaos, to find conspiracy in tragedy, to believe that someone as vital and alive as Tupac couldn't simply be snuffed out by random violence on a Vegas street. Either way, the investigation had revealed something important, that in an age of information and surveillance, it was still possible to disappear. It was still possible to control your own narrative, even from beyond the grave. It was still possible to become legend by choosing when and how your story ended, by taking yourself out of the equation and letting the myth grow in your absence. Her phone buzzed with a new email notification. She checked it, expecting another threat or another journalist looking for an interview or another conspiracy theorist claiming to have the missing piece of the puzzle. Instead, it was from the same scrambled sender who had contacted her back in May, the one who had sent the original invitation to follow the eagle's shadow. The subject line was still blank. The message contained only 3 words, no signature, no explanation. "He sends regards." Ava stared at the screen, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she screenshot the message and saved it to her encrypted backup. She didn't know if it was real or another layer of deception. She didn't know if she should feel validated or terrified. She didn't know if he meant Tupac or someone else entirely. Someone using the legend to manipulate her, to keep her chasing ghosts while the real truth stayed hidden. She didn't know anything for certain anymore, except that certainty itself might be the biggest lie of all. But she knew she couldn't stop now. Stopping meant letting them win, whoever they were. Stopping meant accepting that some truths were too dangerous to pursue, that some questions were better left unasked. And she hadn't become a journalist to accept comfortable lies. She had become a journalist to make people uncomfortable with the truth. She opened a new document and began typing the outline for her next investigation, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her mind already racing ahead to the next lead, the next question, the next shadow to follow. She would dig into the Malaysian trust, try to find someone who knew who had set it up. She would visit the New Mexico property, see if she could get close enough to observe who was living there. She would follow the money trails she hadn't had time to fully explore, trace every dollar that had flowed through Tupac's estate in the years since his death. Because that's what journalists do. They chase the truth, wherever it leads, whatever the cost. Even when the truth refuses to reveal itself clearly, even when the answers create more questions, even when powerful forces want them to stop asking. And sometimes, if they're very lucky or very unlucky, they find something that changes everything. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Miami, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple, colours so vivid they looked artificial, like someone had turned up the saturation to make the world seem more beautiful than it really was. In the distance, she could hear sirens, the ambient soundtrack of urban life, emergency and crisis and human drama playing out in 1,000 small ways across the city. In her earbuds, an old Tupac track played softly, the one from the Don Killuminati album, the one where he rapped about death and rebirth and revenge from beyond the grave. The lyrics seemed to take on new meaning now, as if he had been telling everyone exactly what he planned to do, and no one had believed him because the truth was too outrageous to accept. He had studied Machiavelli in prison. He had learned that the greatest trick was making your enemies think they had won. And maybe, just maybe, he had pulled off the greatest trick of all. Machiavelli lives, he had said, and maybe, just maybe, he was right. Not as the 25-year-old rapper frozen in time by bullets and legend, but as something else, something transformed, something that had chosen to become myth rather than remain mortal. The track ended, and another began, his voice filling her ears with words about thug life and enemies, and surviving against impossible odds. She let it play, let the poetry wash over her, and wondered if somewhere in those lyrics was another clue, another breadcrumb on a trail that might lead nowhere or might lead everywhere. She would keep looking, keep asking, keep digging, even if it took another 3 months or 3 years or 3 decades. because the story wasn't over. It might never be over. And that was okay. Some stories weren't meant to have endings. They were meant to keep unfolding generation after generation, truth mixing with legend until no one could tell where one ended and the other began. That was Tupac's real legacy, she realised. Not the music or the movies or the revolutionary politics, though all of those mattered. His real legacy was teaching an entire culture to question the official story, to look for the truth beneath the surface, to never accept simple answers to complicated questions. He had made skepticism hip, and in doing so, he had created the conditions for his own possible resurrection, because a culture trained to question everything would never stop questioning whether he was really gone. Fade to black. Archival footage plays, showing the flashing lights of an ambulance reflecting off wet pavement on a desert road late at night, September the 7th, 1996. The beginning of a mystery that might never be solved. A legend that would outlive whatever truth had been buried beneath it. The camera lingers on the lights, red and white and blue, pulsing against the darkness like a heartbeat, like proof of life, like a signal to anyone watching that something happened here that changed everything. Then slowly, inexorably, the lights fade to nothing, leaving only darkness and the sound of breathing, of waiting, of questions that echo into silence without answers. But in that silence, if you listen closely, you might hear something. A voice, distant and distorted, rapping about living forever, about being more than flesh and bone, about becoming legend. Or maybe it's just the wind. Maybe it's just your mind creating patterns where none exist, hearing what you want to hear because the alternative is too painful to accept. Either way, the mystery endures, the questions remain, and somewhere, maybe in Belize or Malaysia or New Mexico or nowhere at all, Machiavelli might be smiling at how well the plan worked. End